It started on the night I stopped believing in warmth. The house was quiet, the kind of silence that isn't peaceful but hollow, the kind that echoes when you breathe too loudly. Outside, rain fell in thick, uneven sheets, hammering against the glass, turning the garden into a dark blur of movement and sound. The power had flickered twice, and the only light left came from the small candle burning on the kitchen table. I sat there, hands wrapped around a cold mug, watching wax drip down its side. Every drop seemed to mark another second of a night I wished would end. It had been 4 months since I'd moved here. 4 months since I'd left everything behind. My husband, the noise, the city that had stopped feeling like home. I told everyone I needed quiet, that I wanted space, but the truth was simpler. I wanted to disappear. The rain was the only thing that answered when I spoke to the empty house. It reminded me I was still here, even if no one else was listening. Then I heard it. Faint. Barely there at first. A sound that didn't belong to the storm. A soft, wet whimper, almost human. I froze. It came again, closer this time, followed by the scrape of claws against wood. My stomach tightened. The front porch. Something was out there. I rose, candle in hand, and crossed the living room. The shadows seemed to move with me, stretching and bending in the flickering light. When I reached the door, I hesitated. The wind pushed against it, rattling the hinges. The whimper came once more, longer, desperate, and without thinking, I opened the door. Rain spilled in, cold against my skin. At first, I saw nothing, just the night, thick and silver, trembling with movement. Then, out of the darkness, he appeared. A dog, soaked to the bone, shivering, his fur plastered to his body. His eyes, wide, dark, pleading, found mine as if he'd been searching for them all night. "Oh," I whispered, lowering the candle. He took a small step forward, then stopped at the threshold, his body trembling violently. The rain behind him came down harder, pushing him closer to the doorway. Still, he didn't move until I did. "It's okay," I said, my voice cracking. "You can come in." He hesitated, then crossed the line between storm and safety. The moment he did, something inside me shifted. He shook himself, sending water in every direction, then stood still, looking up at me as if waiting for permission to exist. I set the candle on the table and fetched a towel from the hallway. He didn't resist when I knelt beside him, gently pressing the fabric against his fur. His breath came out in soft huffs, uneven at first, then calmer as the minutes passed. "You poor thing," I murmured. "You must have been out there for hours." He blinked slowly, his eyes never leaving mine. For the first time in months, I felt seen. I let him sleep near the fireplace that night. The storm howled until dawn, but inside there was warmth again, fragile, uncertain but real. I lay on the couch under a blanket, listening to the rhythm of his breathing. Every so often he'd let out a soft sigh, as if even in sleep he couldn't quite believe he was safe. When morning came, I expected him to be gone. But when I opened my eyes, he was still there, curled tight near the ashes of the fire, his chest rising and falling in slow, even motion. He'd stayed. I didn't have the heart to wake him. I just sat there for a while, watching the light crawl across the floor until it found him. It touched his fur, turning it from dull brown to gold, and I thought, how strange that something can shine even after being drenched in darkness. When he finally stirred, he lifted his head and looked at me with that same quiet intensity. Then he stood stretched and walked over, pressing his damp nose against my arm. "Good morning," I whispered. His tail wagged once, a small, deliberate motion, like a secret. That was the moment he stopped being a dog. He became something else, a heartbeat that wasn't mine but matched it anyway. The days that followed blurred together. He followed me everywhere, from room to room, out into the garden, even to the mailbox at the edge of the road. He'd sit and wait, watching every move, as if guarding something fragile. I started calling him Rain. It felt fitting, not because of the storm that brought him, but because of what he represented. Rain cleans things. It washes the dust from the world, fills the cracks, makes room for new life. And that's what he was doing to me. Slowly, silently, erasing what had been rotting inside. I still spoke to him like he could understand. Maybe because I needed to believe someone did. I'd tell him about the city, about the noise, about how I used to sleep next to someone who stopped looking at me long before he left. He'd listen, always still, eyes focused on my face. One night I asked, "Do you think he ever wonders where I went?" Rain tilted his head, that small, curious gesture that made me laugh through the ache. "Yeah," I said. "Me neither." The first time I laughed after the divorce was because of him. It was the third night he'd been with me. I'd been making dinner, something simple, soup and bread, when I heard a crash from the living room. I ran in, heart pounding, only to find him standing over a shattered vase, tail wagging guiltily. "Rain," I gasped. That was my favorite. He froze, ears drooping, eyes wide. Then he took one cautious step back and bumped into the wall. The guilt on his face was almost human. I couldn't help it. I started laughing. The sound startled even me. He looked up, confused at first, then wagged his tail again. Faster this time, as if he'd been waiting for that sound. "It's okay," I said between breaths. "It's just glass." It felt like a lie. It wasn't just glass. It was proof that things could break, and I could still laugh. As days turned into weeks, I started to forget what loneliness used to feel like. We developed a rhythm. Morning walks through the mist, long afternoons spent in the garden where he'd chase shadows while I painted them. At night, he'd curl up near the foot of the bed, far enough to give space, close enough to remind me I wasn't alone. But the house had its moods. On certain nights, when the wind returned and the walls creaked like old bones, I'd lie awake, staring at the ceiling, afraid of what silence might still be hiding. That's when it happened. The night he came into my room. It was late, past midnight, when the thunder started again. The kind that shakes the glass and makes your heartbeat sync with the sky. I'd left the window slightly open, and the wind kept blowing the curtain inward like a ghost trying to speak. I tried to sleep, but the storm wouldn't let me. The rain grew heavier, relentless, and then I heard it. The faint scrape of paws outside my door. He'd been sleeping downstairs by the fireplace. Another crack of thunder. A whine. Then the door pushed open with a soft creak. He stood there in the doorway, his eyes glinting in the flash of lightning. For a second he didn't move. Neither did I. Then he stepped forward, slow, hesitant, and walked to the side of the bed. He looked at me, then at the empty space beside it. I lifted the blanket. "Come on," I whispered. He climbed up carefully, circling once before lying down, his back pressed against my legs. He was warm, his breathing deep and steady, and in that moment, something inside me unclenched. I closed my eyes. The thunder faded into distance, the storm losing its voice. His warmth seeped into me, anchoring me to the present, to the world that was still here, still capable of being kind. When I finally drifted to sleep, I dreamed of nothing but rain and the sound of paws beside me. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the window, soft and forgiving. Rain, the dog not the weather, and was already awake, sitting near the edge of the bed, watching the light move across the floor. He looked peaceful, like he'd been waiting for the morning to arrive before letting himself rest. I reached out and touched his back. "You came inside," I said quietly. He turned his head toward me, ears flicking. I guess I needed that more than I thought. He leaned into my hand, his fur warm under my fingers. That simple act, his choice to cross that small boundary, to find me in the middle of the night, it meant more than anything words could have offered. Because for so long, I'd been the one waiting for someone to come back, and now, finally, something had. By the end of the week, I realized I'd stopped counting days. I no longer marked time by the distance between then and now, by how long it had been since I last heard from the life I'd lost. Now, I measured it in small things. The sound of Rain's tail thumping against the floor when I entered a room, the way his head tilted when I hummed, the rhythm of our walks that somehow always aligned with my heartbeat. Healing, I learned, wasn't loud. It didn't announce itself. It crept in quietly, the way dawn replaces night without asking permission. One afternoon, while we were out walking, an old man from the village stopped us. "Beautiful dog," he said, tipping his hat. "Stray?" "Maybe once," I replied. "Not anymore." The man smiled. "Looks like he found his person." I glanced down at Rain, who looked up at me as if he understood every word. "Yeah," I said softly. "I think he did." That night the house was quiet again, not empty, but full in a different way. I lay in bed, eyes half closed, listening to the steady rhythm of Rain's breathing at the foot of the bed. The window was open, and the sound of gentle rain drifted through, soft, cleansing, endless. And for the first time in years, I didn't dread falling asleep, because I knew that even in the dark, even in the quiet, I wasn't alone anymore. He had waited until I fell asleep that first night. And when he came in from the rain, he brought something with him I thought I'd lost forever. The sound of life returning, one heartbeat at a time. The days after that night blurred together in a quiet, golden kind of peace. I'd wake each morning to the sound of Rain's paws shifting against the floor, the slow rhythm of his breathing matching mine, as though the house itself had found a pulse again. He'd follow me through every morning ritual: coffee brewing, kettle humming, sunlight stretching across the worn wood of the kitchen. He didn't demand attention. He just existed beside me, a constant grounding presence in the soft ache of my solitude. Sometimes I caught myself talking to him without realizing I was doing it, filling the silence with half-formed thoughts and sentences that might have once been meant for someone else. He listened the way only animals can, without interruption, without judgment. There was something sacred about that. After months of silence that had felt suffocating, I found comfort in his quietness, a stillness that didn't press for meaning. It's strange how love can return like that, not in the shape you expect, not with words or promises, but in small, steady things, in breath, in presence. One morning, the rain returned. It came softly at first, a thin mist clinging to the windows, the kind that blurs the world into watercolor. The smell of wet earth filled the house, and I left the back door open while I painted by the window. Rain, the dog, sat just outside, head tilted toward the wind. His fur caught the droplets, and though I called for him to come in, he didn't. He stood there, eyes half closed, breathing in the storm like it was something holy. And for a moment, I understood him. The way he'd waited that night before coming inside, the way he'd faced the storm alone until he was sure it wouldn't break him. Some pain needs to be felt before you can leave it behind. When he finally turned and padded back inside, he shook himself beside me, showering my bare feet with water. I laughed, a sound that felt foreign, unfamiliar. He looked at me, ears perked, tail wagging like he'd been waiting for that sound again. "You're a mess," I said, wiping his fur with an old towel. "But I guess so am I." He leaned into me, pressing his head against my leg, and I swear, for a second, it felt like forgiveness. By late afternoon, the storm had passed. The air outside was heavy with mist, the world washed clean and soft. We walked down the dirt road that led away from the cottage, the earth squelching beneath our steps. The trees along the path dripped quietly, the sound like whispered secrets. He walked slightly ahead of me, but always looked back, making sure I was still there. I'd forgotten what it felt like to be followed by something that wasn't expectation or memory, but simple loyalty. When we reached the river, he stopped. The water moved slow, full from the rain. He waded in up to his chest and looked back at me as if asking permission to go further. "Go on," I said. He dove beneath the surface, then came up shaking, his fur slicked down and gleaming. The laughter that burst out of me startled the birds from the trees. It had been so long since I'd let myself feel that kind of freedom, the kind that doesn't demand you to forget, only to exist. I sat on the bank while he played, throwing sticks that he never quite returned, his joy spilling into the world like sunlight. When the light began to fade, he trotted back to me, dropping one last stick at my feet. "Keep it," I said, smiling. "A souvenir." He barked once, low and soft, and lay down beside me. We stayed there until the first stars appeared. That night, something shifted. The house felt warmer than usual. I lit a small fire and sat on the couch, sketchbook open in my lap. Rain lay curled on the rug, watching the flames. His eyes reflected the light, deep, amber, full of something that always made me feel both calm and seen. As I drew, I realized I was sketching him again. I hadn't meant to. I never meant to, but his shape kept finding its way into my hands, into the lines and shadows that spilled from me without thought. This one was different, though. Not just a portrait, not just fur and eyes and form. This one was about the space between us, the quiet language we shared. When I finished, I set the pencil down and looked at him. He lifted his head slightly, as if waiting for my voice. "I used to be afraid of nights," I said. "They reminded me of everything I lost." He blinked slowly, his tail brushing the rug once, steady. "Now," I whispered. "They remind me that some things find their way to you when the world goes dark." He sighed, that deep, contented sound that seemed to echo from another world. And I realized I wasn't afraid anymore. Weeks passed like that. Quiet, full, simple. The village nearby started to feel less like a foreign place and more like a world I belonged to. The old man at the post office began greeting me by name. The woman from the bakery slipped an extra loaf into my bag some mornings. They asked about the dog, too. Everyone noticed him, his calmness, his gentleness, the way he never left my side. "He's a good one," they'd say, smiling, and he was. But sometimes, when we walked together, I'd catch him staring into the distance, as though remembering something I couldn't see. There was a longing in that gaze, soft, patient, but undeniable. It reminded me of myself. One evening I found a small tag buried beneath the mat by the door. Rusted, worn smooth at the edges, a name faintly engraved across it. Buddy. My heart tightened. I looked over at him. Sleeping, peaceful, his chest rising and falling in that slow, even rhythm I'd come to depend on. Buddy. Someone had loved him once. Someone might still be looking. The thought clung to me like a shadow. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed listening to the soft rhythm of his breathing on the floor beside me. Every exhale reminded me that he wasn't mine to keep. When the clock struck 3, I whispered, "Did you wait for me? Or did I steal you from someone who still waits for you?" He didn't stir. The rain outside answered instead, gentle and constant. And for the first time since I'd met him, the sound made me ache. The next morning, I called the local shelter. A voice on the other end, kind, practiced, told me they'd check their records. I sent a photo, my hands shaking as I typed. Hours passed. The sky outside turned gray again, the wind picking up. I busied myself with meaningless chores, but every time the phone buzzed, my heart jumped. When it finally rang, I almost didn't answer. The voice was the same. "We found something," she said. "A report from 2 towns over. Dog named Buddy. Went missing during the floods last spring." My throat tightened. "Is there an owner listed?" "Yes," she said softly. "A woman. Elderly. She's been calling every week." I closed my eyes. "Would you like her number?" I didn't answer right away. The silence stretched between us. "Yes," I said finally. When I hung up, Rain, Buddy, lifted his head. His tail wagged once. I couldn't look at him. The call was short. Her voice trembled with age but carried a kind of steady strength that made me want to cry. "He came to you?" she asked. Wonder in every word. "Yes," I whispered, "in the middle of a storm." "He always hated thunder," she said softly. "After my husband died, he'd curl up by the bed and wait until I fell asleep. He stayed through every storm but the last one. I thought. She stopped. I swallowed hard. He's safe. Thank you, she said, voice breaking. Would you bring him home? I wanted to say no. I wanted to lie and keep him here, where he'd become the heartbeat of this quiet life. But I couldn't, he wasn't mine. He'd never been. Yes, I said. The word cracked as it left my mouth. The day I drove him home, the sky was the same color as the day we met, heavy, bruised with rain. He sat in the passenger seat, head out the window, the wind tangling his fur. I kept my hand on the wheel and the other on his back, needing the contact as much as he did. The world outside blurred, fields, fences, old barns collapsing under the weight of time. When we pulled into the narrow gravel road, he lifted his head, ears twitching. The small white house came into view, smoke curling from the chimney. A woman stood in the doorway, hands pressed to her mouth. He whimpered. And then, before I could even open the door, he was out. He ran, fast, wild, unstoppable, straight into her arms. She fell to her knees, tears streaming down her cheeks as she whispered his name again and again. I sat there, hands trembling on the wheel, watching through the rain-streaked glass. When she looked up, her eyes met mine. She mouthed the words, "Thank you." I nodded, then I drove away. The silence on the drive home felt different this time. Not heavy, not hollow, just vast. The seat beside me was empty, but his scent still lingered, his fur caught in the fabric of my coat. When I reached the house, the air felt still, almost reverent. His bowl sat by the corner, untouched. The stick he'd dropped weeks ago still lay near the door. I knelt and picked it up. The weight of it in my hands felt like memory itself. Rough, imperfect, real. I placed it on the windowsill, where the light would touch it every morning. Then I sat on the floor and let the quiet wash over me. It didn't break me this time. It held me. Because even though he was gone, he'd left something behind. The proof that even in the loneliest places, love can find its way in if you're brave enough to open the door. That night, I dreamed of rain again, but this time it wasn't dark or cold. It was soft, warm, the kind that makes flowers bloom and rivers rise, and through it I saw him. Running free! Not toward me this time, but forward. The wind carried his name and I whispered it back, not to call him home, but to let him go. When I woke, dawn was breaking. The world outside shimmered, washed clean. I made coffee, opened the door and stood barefoot on the porch. The air smelled of wet grass and new beginnings. Somewhere far off, a dog barked. I smiled. The sound echoed through the valley. Soft, familiar, infinite. And though the house behind me was empty, my heart was not. He had come in from the rain when I needed him most. And when it was time, he had gone back. Not away from me, but into the world he'd taught me to love again. The morning after I said goodbye to him, the house felt impossibly still. The walls seemed to breathe slower, the air heavier somehow, as if the quiet had grown roots overnight. Every sound, every small motion, felt amplified. The kettle's faint whistle, the soft creak of the old floorboards, even the wind brushing against the window pane. His absence wasn't sharp. It was gentle, like the space left by something sacred that had finished its purpose. I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee that had long gone cold, watching a thin line of sunlight creep across the floorboards until it touched the spot where his bed used to be. Dust glimmered in the light, drifting lazily. Tiny ghosts of movement in a world that suddenly felt too still. I tried to picture him at home, with her, safe, loved, whole again. And yet, even as I told myself that, a small ache pressed behind my ribs, the kind that comes from knowing a chapter has ended. Even if it ended well. He had waited for me once. Waited until I fell asleep, until I was ready to be found. And maybe, in some strange way, I had done the same for him. The thought steadied me. I stood, poured out the cold coffee, and opened the door. Outside, the morning was pale and quiet. The rain had passed in the night, leaving the world slick and shining, the grass bowed under the weight of water. The air smelled of pine and earth and possibility. I took a breath. It was time to live again. The days began to move differently. Without him trailing behind me, the rhythm of the house changed, slower but not lonely. The silence was still there, but now it felt softer, like a blanket instead of a cage. I started painting again, not out of escape, but from a need to capture what I had learned. At first, I painted the rain, not as a storm, but as light, soft, translucent, falling across the world like forgiveness. Then came the fields, the trees, the reflections of sky and water. Each painting felt like a piece of him, a way to hold the moments he had given me without keeping him from where he belonged. People in town began to notice. The old man from the post office stopped by one afternoon. He stood before the easel, squinting at the brushstrokes. "You've found something," he said quietly. "Maybe," I replied. He smiled. "Looks like peace." I thought about that for a long time after he left. Peace. Not happiness, not joy, but peace. Something quieter, deeper, something you can only find after losing everything you thought you couldn't live without. One evening, I received a letter. It was from her, the woman who'd taken him home. The handwriting was shaky, the ink faint, but every word carried warmth. "He's doing well," she wrote. "He lies by the window most days, watching the rain. Sometimes when thunder comes, he lifts his head and listens, like he's waiting for someone. I tell him you're safe and he seems to understand. Thank you for loving him when I couldn't find him." Tears blurred the page before I reached the end. She'd attached a photograph, a simple one, taken in a small garden. He was lying on the grass, his fur brighter, his eyes soft. The light fell across his face just like it used to when he slept by my fireplace. Behind him, the world looked alive again. I pressed the photograph to my heart and whispered, "Good boy." Weeks passed. Then months. The season turned quietly, as seasons do when you finally stop counting days. The green of summer faded into amber, and the air grew cool and sharp. I'd started teaching art classes in the village on Saturdays. Just small sessions at the community hall. Children mostly. They'd smear paint on their hands and laugh like every color was a miracle. One morning, as I was cleaning up after class, a girl tugged on my sleeve. "Do you still have the dog?" she asked. I smiled. "No, he went home," she frowned. "Doesn't it hurt?" "Yes," I said softly, "but sometimes the right kind of hurt makes room for better things." She nodded, pretending to understand, and ran off to join the others. I stood there for a moment, surrounded by the scent of paint and rain-damp air, and thought about how simple that truth really was. Some pain heals not because it goes away, but because it transforms into something you can live with. Autumn deepened. The leaves turned gold, then fell, covering the ground in color. The first frost came early that year. I found myself walking the river path again, the one we used to take. The world was different now, quieter, but alive in its own way. I stopped by the water's edge and looked down. The reflection that met me didn't feel like a stranger anymore. There were lines around my eyes, yes, but they were softened by something that hadn't been there before. Gentleness, perhaps. Or acceptance. A sound broke the stillness then, faint, distant but unmistakable, a bark. I turned, heart stuttering for a moment. The world seemed to hold its breath. And then, through the trees, I saw him, running toward me. His fur was brighter now, his gait slower but strong. The distance between us closed with every heartbeat. When he reached me, he didn't leap or bark or beg for attention. He just pressed his head against my knee, breathing hard, tail wagging slow and steady. I knelt, burying my hands in his fur. "Hey, Rain," I whispered. He looked up at me, eyes shining. "Does she know you're here?" He barked once, quiet and amused, as if to say, "Of course." Then she appeared, the elderly woman, walking carefully down the path, wrapped in a thick scarf. She smiled when she saw us. "I thought I'd find him here," she said, her voice like the wind, fragile but steady. "He ran out the moment the gate opened. Seems he remembered the way." I stood, still holding his collar lightly. "I didn't think I'd see him again." "Neither did I," she said. "But he has his own mind. Always has." We laughed softly, the kind of laughter that doesn't need words. She reached out and stroked his head. "He's been restless lately. Maybe he just needed to make sure you were still all right." My throat tightened. "I am," she nodded. "Good. Then I suppose he can rest again." We stood there together, watching as he lay down in the grass, tail flicking, eyes half closed. The wind rustled through the trees, carrying the scent of rain that hadn't yet fallen. After a while, she said, "He's getting older." "I can tell. Still, he's happiest when it rains." "Me too," I said quietly. She smiled, and for a moment, I saw in her the same kind of loneliness I'd once carried, the kind that softens, never really leaves, but turns into something kind. When it was time to go, she touched my hand. "Thank you," she whispered again, "for being there when he needed someone." I shook my head. "He saved me," she nodded, eyes glistening. "That's what love does." They turned to leave. He looked back once, tail wagging, then they were gone. That night, the rain returned. I sat by the window, watching the drops trail down the glass. The candle flickered beside me, its flame small but fierce. I thought of him running through the fields, free and wild, his fur wet and glistening. I thought of how he had arrived that first night, a ghost in the rain, and how he had taught me to open the door. The world outside pulsed with sound, the steady hum of water against earth, the whisper of wind through trees, and underneath it all, I swore I could still hear his footsteps. I closed my eyes and let the sound wash over me. Some love stories never end. They just change form, stretching across distance, time, memory. He had come into my life quietly, without permission, carrying everything I didn't know I needed. He'd waited until I was ready, until I was strong enough to love again, brave enough to let go. And when he came in from the rain, he brought the world back with him. The years that followed were gentle ones, the kind that slip by without notice until you look up one morning and realize you've built something beautiful out of the ruins. I stayed in the cottage, painted through the seasons, walked the same paths, learned to find comfort in the rhythm of things that didn't need to be fixed. Sometimes, I'd still catch glimpses of him, or maybe just the echo of him, when it rained. A shadow moving through the mist, a shape against the trees. Once I dreamed of him again. He was lying on the porch, head resting on his paws, eyes half open. The rain fell softly around him, and the world smelled of new beginnings. When I knelt beside him, he lifted his head, and for the first time, I understood. He wasn't waiting anymore. He was home, and so was I. This morning, as I write these words, the air smells like rain again. The sky is heavy, gray, full. The candle on the table burns low, its flame bending with every breath of wind that sneaks through the cracked window. Somewhere far away, thunder rolls. Soft, distant, familiar. I smile, because I know what comes next. The sound of rain against the roof, the warmth that fills the house when the world outside turns cold. And maybe, if I listen closely enough, the faint sound of paws against the floor, not to haunt, but to remind me that love, once let in, never truly leaves. He waited until I fell asleep once. He came in from the rain, and in doing so, he woke me up to life again.